Baghdad, Adamiyah District, the 14th of February 2004, 0330 hours. 16 men from a U.S. direct action element are moving toward a compound on the eastern bank of the Tigris, 1 block north of the Abu Hanifa Mosque. They have a targeting package built over the previous 72 hours from signals intelligence, 1 informant report, and a pattern of life analysis conducted by an analyst in Baghdad who has never been to Adamiyah and does not speak Arabic. The compound is described in the package as the primary night quarters of a mid-level insurgent finance coordinator. What the compound actually is, as determined by 8 weeks of patient human source reporting by 3 SAS intelligence operators who are currently 3 kilometers away watching this operation proceed on a radio feed, is an Iraqi National Guard checkpoint that has been made to look like a civilian compound. The ambush inside it is already prepared. 6 insurgents are waiting in the 2 rooms on the upper floor. This is not intelligence that the direct action element has been given. It was offered. It was declined. To understand what happened in Adamiyah in February 2004, you have to understand what the joint counter-terrorism effort in Baghdad looked like in the 12 months after the fall of Saddam Hussein's government. The U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, had deployed elements to Iraq in the late spring of 2003, and by the autumn of that year it was operating under the command of Major General Stanley McChrystal, who had taken over JSOC in September and was in the process of transforming it from a special mission unit that conducted occasional high-value operations into something that looked more like an industrial targeting system. McChrystal was not a conventional commander in the traditional sense. He was a systems thinker who understood networks and wanted to apply network theory to the problem of an insurgency operating as a distributed, adaptive system. His concept was simple and brutal. You could not defeat a networked insurgency by moving at bureaucratic speed. You had to raid faster than the network could reconstitute. If you could conduct a successful direct action mission every night, if you could turn intelligence into action within hours instead of days, you could systematically dismantle an insurgent network before it had time to learn from its losses and adapt. The concept was sound. The execution required fusing intelligence collection, analysis, and action into a single continuous cycle that operated without the traditional delays of a military planning process. It required machines for making decisions quickly, and it required people in those machines who could accept incomplete information and move forward. The strategic context of early 2004 Iraq was one of accelerating violence and institutional collapse. The Coalition Provisional Authority, which had dissolved the Iraqi army in May 2003, was struggling to reconstitute Iraqi security forces capable of maintaining basic control. American casualties had doubled from 2003 to 2004, climbing from 486 deaths in the invasion and initial occupation year to over 800 by the end of 2004. The insurgency, which American planners had initially assessed as consisting primarily of Ba'athist dead-enders with no popular support, had evolved into a complex network of nationalist insurgents, foreign jihadists, criminal organizations, and sectarian militias competing for control of the cities and countryside. Adamiyah, historically Sunni-dominated and full of former Ba'athist officers and Saddam-era military personnel, had become a center of insurgent activity. The tempo of American operations had increased dramatically in response, driven by McChrystal's theory that overwhelming operational pace could compensate for the failure to establish control through institutional means. The U.S. element of this effort, drawn primarily from 1st SFOD Delta, was exceptionally good at the action end of that cycle. Delta operators had trained for exactly this type of high-tempo, close-target reconnaissance and assault work, and under McChrystal's direction they were doing it with increasing effectiveness. By early 2004, Delta was running multiple direct action missions per week in Baghdad and its suburbs, moving at a pace that the insurgency was beginning to struggle to keep up with. The operations were producing a remarkable rate of captures and kills. The methodology appeared to be working. The intelligence picture was improving. The network was being dismantled. The British element, Task Force Black, built around a squadron from 22 SAS rotating through a 6-month deployment, was operating alongside the American effort, but was not always moving at the same speed. The SAS had developed a different approach to the Baghdad intelligence problem, one that emphasized the systematic cultivation of human sources inside the insurgent networks, rather than the high-tempo hammering of individual targets identified primarily through signals collection. This was not a deliberate choice to move slower. It was a different methodology applied to the same problem. This approach had its roots in decades of SAS experience in environments where technical intelligence was limited and human intelligence was the only tool that actually worked. In Northern Ireland, in Oman, in the long, slow campaigns where the enemy was patient and the intelligence was always thin, the regiment had learned that the information you could get from a trusted source who had spent 3 months inside an organization was worth more than any amount of intercept data from outside it. The source network you built slowly and carefully would outlast the intelligence picture you assembled quickly. It would also, if you built it right, tell you when the quick picture was wrong. It would tell you that the target the intercepts were describing was not the target at all. It would warn you of prepared ambushes. It would distinguish the actual network structure from the structure that the enemy was broadcasting for consumption by surveillance assets. In Adamiyah in the winter of 2003 to 2004, the 3 SAS intelligence specialists, Sergeant Daniel Greaves, Corporal Michael Farr, and a third man whose name has not been released, had been running a network of 8 sources across the district for 8 weeks. Adamiyah was one of Baghdad's most complex districts. Historically Sunni, home to some of the last Saddam-era Ba'ath Party loyalists, bordered by the Tigris on its western edge and by a ring of densely built residential streets that had been the source of some of the heaviest urban resistance since the fall of the regime. It was not a district where strangers moved freely or where sources could be recruited casually. Every recruitment required multiple intermediaries, multiple meetings, multiple validation steps. Every source Greaves ran in Adamiyah had cost him time that could not be compressed. The district punished impatience. It rewarded the operator who was willing to move at the speed the terrain and the culture imposed, rather than the speed the operational tempo demanded. Greaves himself was a man of particular background and temperament. He had spent 2 years in Northern Ireland in the 1990s, during the complex period of the peace process, when the requirement for human source intelligence had been absolute and the standard for validation had been high. He had learned to read a neighborhood the way you read a face, by understanding the small, constant variations in expression and mood, rather than by looking for dramatic shifts. He had learned that in a conflict where the enemy and the civilian population were physically co-located, the only way to win was to know the civilian population better than the enemy did. He carried that understanding to Adamiyah. The district's insurgent networks were embedded in families, in tribal structures, in business relationships that had existed before the war and would exist afterward. You could not separate the insurgent from the civilian context without missing the actual nature of what was happening. Greaves understood this in a way that made him both more effective and more maddening to task force commanders who wanted clear intelligence pictures leading to clear targets. They had not run a single direct action mission in Adamiyah during that period. They had attended briefings, shared summaries of what their sources were telling them, and quietly built a picture of the district's insurgent infrastructure that was more detailed, more textured, and more accurately reflective of how the network actually functioned than anything the signals intelligence picture had produced. The network also told them, in the first week of February 2004, that someone in the JSOC intelligence chain was working with bad information. The specific warning came from a source Greaves had been running for 6 weeks, a former civil servant in the Saddam-era Interior Ministry who had been recruited through a contact in the Adamiyah business community and who had subsequently demonstrated, through 3 rounds of verification, that his reporting was accurate and that his access was genuine. This source occupied a particular position in Adamiyah's social structure, well known enough to move about without suspicion, connected enough to have access to information about the insurgent network's administrative structures, but not so deep in the network as to be a frontline operative. He was, in intelligence terms, optimally placed to know about plans and preparations that were being made at the coordination level. In the first week of February, This source told Greaves that a location in the district, a compound on the eastern bank of the Tigris, 1 block north of the Abu Hanifa Mosque, had recently been prepared as an ambush position. A local commander known to Greaves's source as Abu Khalaf had received intelligence from someone inside the JSOC targeting cycle, or from someone connected to that cycle, indicating that a direct action team was likely to raid the compound within the next 10 days. The raid was expected on the basis of a manufactured intelligence picture that had been fed to a JSOC source specifically to draw a team into the compound. Abu Khalaf had positioned 6 armed men on the upper floor of the compound in the 2 rooms that faced the courtyard and had instructed them to wait. When the assault element entered the courtyard, the men would open fire from prepared positions with cover and superior geometry. A 4-minute firefight in a confined space against a prepared enemy was not a scenario Delta operators encountered often. It was the scenario a network designed to preserve itself would create if it could. Greaves filed the warning report on the 7th of February 2004. It went through the Task Force Black Intelligence Officer to the Joint Task Force staff. The report described the specific compound, the specific preparation, and the specific source basis. It assessed the compromise of a JSOC intelligence source as likely, recommended an immediate review of all target packages involving Adamiyah, and explicitly warned against any planned or contemplated direct action against the flagged compound. The report was read by the Task Force Black Intelligence Officer, the Joint Task Force Operations Officer, and a senior American targeting analyst. The targeting analyst's response, delivered verbally at a coordination meeting on the 8th of February, was that the SAS source network's credibility could not be verified to the standard required to override a formally developed targeting package. The American targeting package on the Adamiyah compound was based on 2 confirmed reliable sources, a signals intercept, and a pattern of life analysis. The SAS report was based on a single source with no corroborating technical collection. The analyst recommended proceeding with the planned operation while taking the SAS warning under advisement. The phrase, "under advisement," was used at the coordination meeting. It is not a phrase that had much operational weight in Adamiyah in February 2004. Greaves asked to brief the direct action element personally before the mission. He was told the element had reviewed all available intelligence and was proceeding. The mission launched on the 14th of February. 16 men, 2 vehicles to the insertion point, then on foot, 700 meters to the compound. They moved through streets that were quiet in the way that Adamiyah streets were sometimes quiet at 0330, a quiet that people who knew the district could read and people who did not know it could not. The team's point element reached the compound gate at 0347. The gate was unlocked. This was consistent with the targeting package, which had assessed the compound as an active quarters location and had predicted the gate would be accessible. It was consistent with a great many things that had been deliberately arranged. The assault element entered the courtyard. The upper floor windows were dark. The 2 forward operators moved toward the residential building door. At that moment, from both upper floor windows simultaneously, the 6 men that Abu Khalaf had positioned came into the fight. The contact lasted 4 minutes. Those 4 minutes require a specific description because the discipline and skill that the assault element demonstrated during them is part of the story, not separate from it. From 2 upper floor windows, simultaneously, 6 insurgents fired into the courtyard. The assault element's point operators were in the open, 3 meters from the residential building door, when the fire started. 2 of them went down immediately, hit in the first burst from the right window. The remaining operators reacted within 2 seconds. 4 men went to the wall on either side of the courtyard, returning fire at the windows. 1 man reached the 2 wounded and began immediate trauma care in the open courtyard under direct fire. 2 men went through the residential building door at ground level and began clearing upward. The geometry of the building meant the insurgents on the upper floor could not fire down through the floor. The assault element was in the building and moving up before the insurgents could reposition. The 4-minute clock was the time between first contact and the moment the last upper floor room was cleared, with all 6 insurgents secured. It was a textbook suppression and clearance under fire. It was executed by men who were shot at in a prepared killing ground, and responded within their training parameters without hesitation. In those 4 minutes, 3 American operators were hit, 2 with serious wounds, 1 with wounds that would prove fatal before the medevac reached the field hospital at the green zone. The assault element suppressed the upper floor, cleared the building room by room, and secured all 6 of Abu Khalaf's men within the 4-minute window. The speed and discipline of the clearance, under direct fire from a prepared ambush position, was a display of the highest professional competence. It was also a display of exactly the situation the SAS warning had described, happening exactly where and how the warning had said it would happen. The ambush had been prepared precisely. The timing had been precise. The coordination had worked. The only element that had not gone according to plan was that the assault element had the training and discipline to suppress the fire and clear the position rather than being pinned or routed. The element extracted. The medevac was running before they reached the vehicles. Sergeant First Class Andrew Belton, 1st SFOD Delta, died at 0521 on the 14th of February 2004 from wounds sustained in the Adamiyah compound. He had been in Delta for 6 years and had deployed to Afghanistan twice before Iraq. He was 31 years old. He had a wife and 2 children. He had volunteered for the Adamiyah rotation because he was a professional soldier and the fight was in Iraq. He died in a compound he should not have entered based on intelligence that should have been heard. The after-action review began on the 15th of February, the morning after the operation. Within 12 hours of the medevac delivering Belton's body to the field hospital at the Green Zone, the task force commander had convened a preliminary incident review and placed a formal investigation order. The investigation was assigned to a senior U.S. Army officer without direct operational involvement in the Baghdad targeting cycle, which was the standard approach for ensuring the appearance of independence. The investigating officer read the full targeting package, the full intelligence record for Adamiyah, and the SAS warning report filed on the 7th of February. He interviewed 11 people, targeting analysts, operations officers, the mission commander, and members of the assault element who had been present in the compound. He requested access to Greaves and the task force black intelligence officer. Both spoke to him voluntarily and at length. The Joint Task Force commander ordered a full investigation on the 16th of February. The investigation ran for 3 weeks and produced a document that was 40 pages long. And the 40-page document is not publicly available. Its contents have been described in general terms by people with knowledge of it who were not speaking on record. What those descriptions agree on is this. The document concluded that the SAS source report filed on the 7th of February 2004 had accurately described the threat at the Adamiyah compound, that the assessment of the report's reliability had been insufficient, and that the decision to proceed with the direct action mission without further verification of the SAS warning had been a material factor in the outcome. It also concluded that the JSOC targeting source, whose information had been used to build the original compound package, had been deliberately fed the information by a counterintelligence operation run by Abu Khalaf's network, confirming the specific mechanism of the compromise that Greaves's source had reported on the 7th of February. The source had not known he was being manipulated. The information had been designed to pass the standard verification checks that the JSOC cycle used. It had passed them. The source believed he was providing accurate information. The network had believed it was receiving accurate targeting intelligence. Both had been wrong in ways that only became apparent after a man was dead. The document made 7 recommendations. The investigating officer had spoken to enough people to understand that the failure was systemic rather than individual, and his recommendations reflected that understanding. They addressed procedures and structures rather than assigning personal culpability. This was appropriate. No individual had acted dishonestly or outside their training, and it was also the approach that an institution takes when it wants to fix a problem without creating the kind of public accountability that produces defensive reactions from the people who need to change their behavior. 7 procedural recommendations, clearly written, carefully constrained to what was actionable. Nothing that required anyone to say they had been wrong in a way they could not professionally accommodate. The first was the establishment of a formal review process requiring that any intelligence report from a coalition partner unit which directly contradicted a planned targeting package must be briefed to the assault element commander before mission launch, regardless of the source basis assessment. The second was a revision of the source verification criteria for targeting packages in Adamiyah and surrounding districts, to incorporate human source intelligence from coalition partner networks as a mandatory validation input. The remaining 5 addressed specific procedural gaps in the joint intelligence fusion process. The document was not described in any of its 40 pages as an apology. It was an investigation report. But in the operational language of a community where accountability is managed through formal documents rather than personal acknowledgements, a 40-page finding that said your targeting process had dismissed a valid warning and that a man had died as a result was the closest thing that world produces to an apology. The SAS intelligence operators who had filed the warning read the document. They did not comment on it publicly. Greaves had a conversation with the targeting analyst, the one who had said the SAS source could not be verified to standard sometime in the week after the investigation concluded. The conversation was not formal. It happened in a corridor outside the Joint Operations Center at Baghdad. The analyst said he wanted to explain his thinking on the Adamiyah assessment. Greaves listened. When the analyst finished, Greaves said he understood the assessment and that he wanted to explain his source's access in more detail so the verification problem didn't happen the same way again. They spent 40 minutes in the corridor going through the source methodology, the validation markers Greaves used, and the specific indicators that had made the 7th of February report credible to him. Greaves explained how you identified a source who had real access versus a source who was telling you what you wanted to hear. He explained how you tested that access repeatedly without burning the source. He explained the specific indicators that told him his source was reporting accurately about Adamiyah when signals collection was describing something different. The analyst subsequently requested a formal presentation on the SAS source network methodology for the full JSOC targeting staff. The presentation was given in late February 2004 by the Task Force Black Intelligence Officer, with Greaves providing technical detail. It ran 2 hours. It covered source recruitment, validation, the management of compromised sources, and the specific indicators used to assess when a target picture might have been deliberately constructed for counterintelligence purposes. It explained how to read human source reporting against technical collection and know which one was telling the truth when they disagreed. It was, in effect, a masterclass in the intelligence methodology that Delta and JSOC had developed successfully at high speed and high volume, but which could still miss things that a slower, a more methodical approach would catch. The session was not publicly described at the time and has not been described in any open-source account of the Iraq campaign. Its effects were documented in a change to the joint targeting process that was implemented in March 2004 and remained in effect for the remainder of the Task Force Black Task Force Green joint operation. The change required that any human intelligence report from a coalition partner network that directly assessed a proposed target as compromised or prepared as an ambush position must be briefed to the mission commander and to the assault element at the final planning stage, with the source reliability assessment explained in full before the mission was authorized. The mission commander could proceed, but he could not proceed without having heard it. It was not a perfect fix. No intelligence system produces perfect fixes, but it ensured that a warning once made and filed could not be ignored at the point of decision. The comment "under advisement" deserves a moment. It is a phrase that appears in operational records when a decision has been made and a contrary piece of information has been acknowledged without being acted on. It creates a formal record of receipt without creating a formal record of response. A report taken under advisement has been heard. Whether it has been believed, whether it has changed any calculation, whether it will be revisited, these questions are left open. The phrase is useful precisely because it is non-committal. It places the burden of the next step on the person who filed the report, rather than on the person who received it. In a fast-moving targeting cycle running multiple missions per week, under advisement was very close to no. It was just no with a procedural buffer. Greaves understood this when the phrase was used at the 8th of February meeting. He had used similar language himself in earlier postings, when he was the one receiving reports he didn't have the authority to act on. He did not protest the assessment, he noted it. He filed his warning report through the correct channel and ensured it was documented. What he could not do, and what the protocol of the Joint Task Force did not permit him to do, was contact the assault element directly and tell them what his source had said. The assault element would receive the intelligence summary prepared by the Joint Task Force intelligence staff. Whether his warning appeared in that summary, and in what form, was not in his control. It did not appear in the summary. The intelligence officer who prepared the summary assessed the SAS single-source report as insufficient to include in a planning document without corroborating collection. He was following his training. The training said that a single-source report from a partner network without technical corroboration is a data point, not a finding. The summary did not lie. It simply did not contain the most important piece of information about the target. It is worth noting what the SAS source network in Adamir had cost to build. The 8 sources that Greaves, Farr, and the 3rd intelligence specialist were running in February 2004 had been recruited over 8 weeks. Each recruitment had involved multiple meetings, background checks, validation exercises, and payments that ranged from $100 to several thousand, depending on the access level and the risk involved. The infrastructure to manage 8 sources in a district like Adamir in early 2004, secure meeting locations, communication protocols, cutouts, documentation, required continuous management and constant vigilance about which sources knew of each other and which did not. The total cost, in money and in the time of 3 highly skilled operators who were not conducting any direct action while they built the network, was substantial and is not recorded in any public accounting. 3 SAS operators represent a capability that could have been deployed on a dozen direct action missions instead. The choice to build sources instead was a choice to accept fewer immediate tactical wins in exchange for better intelligence. The network had also, by February 2004, produced intelligence that was considerably more detailed and operationally useful than anything the signals picture had generated about Adamir. The district's insurgent finance structure was almost entirely mapped. The command relationships between 3 competing factions in the district had been characterized in a level of detail that allowed the task force to understand which faction was providing which capability and what each group's particular vulnerabilities were. This was not intelligence that could be collected quickly. It was intelligence that required human presence, human trust, and human time. By the time of the Adamir warning, that trust had been built enough times that the sources were willing to report things that contradicted the official picture, which meant they understood they would be believed even when they were saying no. The question of whether the cost was justified was answered, in the view of the people who produced it, by the Adamir report on the 7th of February. The network had cost 8 weeks to build and had produced a warning that was precisely accurate about a prepared ambush at a specific location on a specific night. That is the answer. The question of whether it was justified in the view of the people who had declined to act on it was answered eventually in 40 pages of investigation report. That is also an answer. Whether the 2 answers were the same answer, reached by different routes, or whether they were genuinely different assessments of the same problem, is a question that nobody inside the Joint Task Force in 2004 was inclined to resolve publicly. There is a specific detail about the 14th of February mission that does not appear in any of the available accounts, but that emerges from the timeline. The assault element launched knowing that the SAS had filed a contrary intelligence report. The targeting analyst had taken it under advisement on the 8th of February. The mission launch was on the 14th of February. 6 days elapsed between the warning and the assault. In those 6 days, the correct process would have been to either corroborate the warning with additional collection or conduct further assessment of its source basis before launching. Neither happened. The mission was planned on the original targeting package. The warning existed in the record. The record was not consulted at the final planning stage in a way that brought the warning to the assault element commander's attention. And this is the procedural failure that the 40-page investigation identified most directly. Not the collection failure, not the source compromise. Both of those were things that happened to the system from outside. The failure was internal. A warning was filed. A warning was received. A mission proceeded. A man died. The sequence was documented. The documentation was specific. Abu Khalaf was captured 4 weeks after the Adamiyah compound operation. He was found through a combination of signal collection and human source reporting. Both methods, used together, producing what neither had produced alone. The capture was conducted by a joint SAS Delta team, the first jointly planned and jointly executed direct action mission since the Adamiyah incident. The planning process for it had incorporated the new targeting review protocol from the beginning. The mission ran without incident. Abu Khalaf was processed through the detainee system and interrogated over several weeks. He confirmed the mechanism of the JSOC source compromise and identified the intelligence officer in his network who had managed the operation. That officer was subsequently captured, and the information he provided in turn led to the identification of 2 other active counterintelligence operations targeting JSOC collection systems in Baghdad. The targeting analyst from the corridor conversation submitted a request to be formally assigned to the Joint Intelligence Fusion Cell, working alongside the Task Force Black Intelligence operators for the remainder of his deployment. The request was approved. He worked with Greaves's team for 8 weeks before rotating back to his parent unit. He later wrote in an internal NSA assessment of human-SIGINT integration in Iraq that the 8 weeks had changed his understanding of what source validation actually meant in an urban counterterrorism environment. The assessment was classified. Sergeant First Class Andrew Belton's name was added to the Special Operations Memorial in Fort Bragg on a date that has not been publicly released. His operational record noted his 6 years in Delta, his 2 Afghanistan deployments, and his Iraq deployment. It noted the date of his death. It did not describe the intelligence argument that had preceded it, because that argument was classified. And because classified documents do not typically include the word should, the 40-page report sat in the Joint Task Force archive. It was not the apology that the word implies, because no institution in that world writes apologies. It was something more uncomfortable than an apology, a precise, documented accounting of what had been dismissed, what it had contained, and what the dismissal had cost. 40 pages, every one of them in the file, every one of them saying the same thing in the careful, passive voice language of official findings. The warning had been there. The warning had been correct. The warning had not been heard. The phrase, the Yanks called them amateurs, was used in the Joint Task Force environment during the early months of 2004. A period when the very high operational tempo of the Delta-led targeting cycle had produced a culture of speed that was occasionally dismissive of assets that moved at a different pace. The SAS was not slow because it was less capable. It was operating at the pace that its methodology required, and its methodology was producing intelligence that the faster pace could not generate. The phrase reflected a category error, mistaking different priorities for inferior capability, and it was a category error that the Adamiyah compound corrected in a way that no briefing or presentation could have matched. The 40-page report made that correction permanent, not by naming the phrase or the people who had used it, by documenting precisely and in detail what the slower methodology had produced and what the dismissal of its product had cost. In the language of institutional accountability, 40 pages is substantial. In the language of what was actually lost on the 14th of February 2004, 40 pages is almost nothing. Sergeant First Class Andrew Belton was 31 years old. He had a wife and 2 children. He had done everything right. The failure was not his. The broader implications of the Adamiyah incident rippled through the American military intelligence establishment in Iraq. The most immediate impact was on how Task Force Green and Task Force Black would coordinate their targeting efforts. Regular liaison meetings were established where SAS intelligence operators could brief American targeting analysts on the human source methodology and the specific indicators that the SAS used to assess source reliability. These briefings, conducted formally and informally over the following months, contributed to a significant shift in how American targeting analysts understood the integration of human and technical collection. American intelligence officers began to appreciate the specific value of human source reporting in an environment where the enemy was actively conducting counterintelligence operations designed to feed false information through the American collection systems. The 40-page investigation document that had found the SAS warning to have been accurate and materially relevant was eventually declassified, though the details remained obscured and the names of key figures were redacted. When it entered the unclassified record years later, it was catalogued as a document about intelligence procedures and operational failures in Iraq, without any elaborate explanation of what the document actually meant or why it mattered. A scholar or analyst reading the declassified document in 2015 or 2020 would understand that the American military had experienced an intelligence failure that had resulted in casualties, that the failure had involved the dismissal of a coalition partner warning, and that the military had conducted a formal investigation and issued recommendations for procedural improvement. The reader might not fully grasp that the failure had been preventable, that it had involved a man's death, or that it had revealed fundamental problems with how the American military was approaching counterterrorism operations in an urban environment. The intellectual problem that the Adamiyah incident raised was never fully resolved, though it was addressed in increasingly sophisticated ways as the Iraq campaign continued. The problem was this: how do you integrate human source intelligence, which is inherently unreliable and often based on single sources with limited means of corroboration, into a targeting process that has been designed for technical intelligence, which is inherently more reliable, but which can be deliberately manipulated by an intelligent adversary? The American military eventually developed a hierarchical approach in which human source reporting was taken seriously, but was always cross-checked against technical collection and pattern-of-life analysis. But this approach still carried the implicit assumption that technical intelligence was more reliable than human intelligence, an assumption that the Adamiyah incident had demonstrated to be sometimes incorrect. The question of source validation standards continued to be debated within the American intelligence community throughout the Iraq campaign. Some analysts argued that the standards for accepting human source intelligence needed to be raised higher, that the Adamiyah incident demonstrated the danger of accepting single-source reporting without extensive corroboration. Other analysts argued that raising the standards higher would simply mean that more intelligence would go uncollected, that real sources with real access would be filtered out of the system because they could not meet an impossible standard of verification. The tension between these two positions was never fully resolved. The practical compromise that emerged was that human source reporting would be taken seriously if it came from a source that had been previously validated through multiple rounds of successful reporting, or if it came from a source that had multiple levels of access and could provide specific details that could be independently verified. The SAS intelligence operators who had been involved in building the Adamiyah source network eventually rotated out of Iraq. Greaves continued to serve in the regiment for several more years before eventually leaving the military. Farr continued his military career and eventually rose to senior positions in the British military intelligence apparatus. The third man, whose name was never released, disappeared into the classified realm entirely. His contributions to the operation known only to a handful of people who had the access to know about him. In the way of military operations, the individuals involved moved on to other assignments, other rotations, other operational theaters. What they had accomplished in Adamiyah was incorporated into the broader understanding of how intelligence and operations should be integrated, but the specific individuals who had accomplished it faded from the public record. The moment of the warning, the moment when Greaves had filed his report describing the prepared ambush at the specific compound on the specific night, had become a kind of standard case study in military intelligence circles. When intelligence professionals were trained in how to handle contradictory intelligence reports, the Adamiyah case was often referenced as an example of what could happen when a valid warning was dismissed without sufficient hearing. When military planners discussed how to structure the relationship between intelligence collection and direct action operations, the Adamiyah case was referenced as an example of what could go wrong when the structure was not adequate to the problem. but the case remained classified in its specifics. The names of most of the principals remained obscured. The details of the operation, the specifics of the source information, the exact mechanisms of the intelligence failure remained sealed in classified documents. What entered the public understanding was the pattern. A warning had been issued, the warning had been disregarded, casualties had resulted, and an investigation had found the warning to have been correct. The pattern was powerful enough to drive institutional change. The specifics remained hidden, known only to those who had the particular access and the particular reason to go looking for them. Sergeant First Class Andrew Belton's family received a folded flag and a pension. His service record noted his commitment and his professional competence. The operational circumstances of his death were classified and remained classified for years. His name was inscribed on the Special Operations Memorial, one name among many. The warning that had predicted the exact form of his death remained in the classified archive, documented and available to anyone with the security clearance and the particular reason to go looking for it. But for the general public, for the broader military and intelligence community outside the classified world, the specifics of what happened at the Adamiyah compound on the 14th of February 2004 remained unknown. What was known was that there had been a failure, that the failure had been investigated, and that procedures had been changed to prevent the same kind of failure from happening again. This was the nature of classified intelligence failures. They entered the public record as patterns and general findings, but the specific incidents that generated those patterns and findings remained hidden from public view. The intelligence community learned from its failures, but it learned in private. The mechanisms of learning were documented in classified reports and in classified discussions. The conclusions of that learning were eventually embedded in doctrine and procedure in ways that were occasionally visible to outside observers, but more often were simply incorporated into the background of how organizations did their business. The warning that had been accurately filed on the 7th of February, the warning that had predicted the exact form of the threat, remained in that classified archive, waiting in a file that most people would never see, archived in a system that most of the world had no knowledge of, embodying a lesson that the intelligence community had learned, but that could not be fully communicated to a democratic public that did not have access to the classified evidence that supported that lesson.